in each of the situations we've brought up, as well as the situations we haven't brought up. You will step in and you'll intervene on our behalf. We pray these things in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, was everybody able to at least skim the chapter? Okay, cool. Hey, there we go. Jennifer, both of the times you've come, we've had a very small crowd. We usually have more people than this, but one person's at the beach, one person's at the doctor, one person's, I can't remember what she's doing. Yeah, so we're short a few folks today, but glad to have you. So this week's chapter is all about archaeology. Now I've got to confess, I do not care about this chapter at all. I didn't get a chance to reread the chapter until yesterday to see what I was going to be teaching on. If I had read it in advance, I probably would have said read chapters 5 and 6. We'll mostly talk about chapter 6 because I'm way less interested in this than I am in the stuff we'll be talking about in the future weeks. You'll see why in just a minute. But this chapter is all about archaeology, and we're going to talk a little bit about the stuff that was directly in the chapter, but we're going to spend a whole lot more time talking about some stuff the chapter doesn't really touch on, but that we need to understand in order to really wrap our heads around a lot of the stuff that the chapter does touch on. So we're going to talk about archaeology today. Specifically, does archaeology disprove the Bible? Now that's a suspenseful sounding title, but you know where we're going to land, right? We're going to land saying, no, archaeology does not disprove the Bible, but we're actually going to go significantly further than that, because even though we're answering the question, does archaeology disprove the Bible? No, this shouldn't even be a question. The fact that we can ask this question at all is actually really silly. We're asking it because a lot of people make this claim, right? A lot of people say, well, you know, archaeology has disproven the Bible. Ever heard somebody say something like that? They'll say, archaeology has proven that the Exodus never happened. They'll say, archaeology has proven that the Jews were never slaves in Egypt, that God never rescued them from Egypt, that God never brought them into the Promised Land. They'll say, archaeology has proven that the Canaanite conquest never happened. You know, the story in Joshua, they'll say that's a story that the authors of the Bible made up. They'll say that the archaeology has proven that King David never existed. There was never a dynasty of King David, and so on and so forth. They'll make all these claims. They'll say archaeology has proven that these things never happened. They'll say archaeology has disproven the Bible. And so because so many people make those claims, we're going to begrudgingly talk about this issue. We're going to begrudgingly have a week where we ask, does archaeology disprove the Bible? But I want to let you know in advance, the answer is no, and that anybody who knows even a little bit what they're talking about would tell you the answer was obviously no, and that the question is frankly stupid. The reason I say that is because none of this is how archaeology works. Archaeology can demonstrate that something did happen, but archaeology can't really demonstrate that something didn't happen. Does that make sense? You can prove through archaeology that a certain historical event did occur. You cannot prove through archaeology that a certain historical event did not occur. Think about it. How would you even do that, right? What are you going to dig up that's going to disprove some historical event, right? It's not like you can dig up some video evidence of something not happening, right? It doesn't make any sense. So archaeology doesn't work that way. Archaeology can prove that certain things did happen, but it really can't prove that certain things didn't happen? I want to give a handful of cases in point. There is a long list, grammar. There's a long list of major historical events that everybody knows happened that we have no archaeological evidence for. There's a long list of very important historical events that we have no physical proof for. I want to go in ascending order of importance and shockingness. I don't think the chapter talked about this. I kind of sped through it yesterday. But first things first, the Battle of Zama. You remember the Battle of Zama from your high school history class? Once again, I know it's been a few years, so you might have forgotten. The Battle of Zama is one of the most famous military events in all of world history. It's the battle in which Hannibal, remember Hannibal? Not Hannibal Lecter from the Silence of the Lambs movies, but the historical figure Hannibal, the powerful warlord Hannibal. The Battle of Zama was the day that Hannibal's reign of terror was finally put to an end. He was defeated by the Roman army, and at long last there was peace because Hannibal was finally put down. That's the Battle of Zama. There is no physical evidence that the Battle of Zama ever happened. We have never uncovered anything in any archaeological dig or investigation ever that actually proves that the Battle of Zama ever happened. So, what does that mean? Does that mean that the Battle of Zama is a fake story? No. Because we have so much testimony, just to jump ahead a little bit, we have so much historical testimony about the Battle of Zama. We have so many different ancient sources from ancient Roman historians, ancient Greek historians, historians from back in the day, near when the Battle of Zama happened. We had so many ancient sources that testify to the Battle of Zama, but we don't need to uncover any archaeological evidence to believe in the Battle of Zama because so many people at that time were talking about it. You know what I'm talking about? Does that make sense? It's like if a whole bunch of people came to you later this afternoon and said, "Hey, we all went to Wendy's today." Would you be like, "I need you to provide me with the trash from your Wendy's trip, or I can't believe that you went to Wendy's"? Obviously not, right? You're going to believe the testimony of those people that they went to Wendy's, right? Same thing is true with the Battle of Zama, right? There's an ocean of testimony to the existence of the Battle of Zama, so we don't actually need to uncover anything in some archaeological dig to prove that the Battle of Zama happened. If somebody does some archaeological dig on the spot where the Battle of Zama was said to have taken place, and they find a whole bunch of swords, a whole bunch of helmets, a whole bunch of corpses with holes in their chests, that would be evidence for the Battle of Zama, right? That would enhance the testimony about the Battle of Zama, but we don't need it. And the fact that they haven't found any swords, any helmets, any corpses, and any digs where the Battle of Zama was said to take place doesn't mean the Battle of Zama didn't happen. The fact that we haven't found any archaeological evidence for the Battle of Zama doesn't prove that it didn't happen. It just means we don't have proof it did. There's a difference. You see that? There's a difference between an absence of proof and a proof of absence. Ever heard that term? An absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, or an absence of proof is not proof of absence. So just because we don't have any archaeological evidence for the Battle of Zama does not mean it didn't happen. That is not proof that it didn't happen. Another similar example is the city of Akkad. You may or may not remember this one from your high school history class, right? But the city of Akkad was the capital city of the Akkadian Empire. The Akkadian Empire is where the Akkadian language came from. This is one of the most pivotal, most important, most historic cities in one of the most pivotal, most important, most historic empires that produced the most pivotal, most historic, most important language in the ancient world. Way back in the day, before Rome, before Greece, before Persia, before all of that, Acadia was the empire. Before Babylon, before all of it, Acadia was like the place. This was the superpower of the world. It was kind of like America back in the day. That was Acadia. And all of the important work in Acadia, right, all of the governing, all of the legislating, all of the arts and culture and everything was all coming out of the capital city of Akkad. Here's the problem. We have no idea where that is. We literally have no idea where the city of Akkad was located. We've never uncovered the city of Akkad. And so even though we have mountains of testimony about the city of Akkad from ancient Akkadian literature, we've never uncovered the city of Akkad in an archaeological dig. So, does that mean that there was not actually a city of Akkad? Does that mean that the city of Akkad is just something that all those ancient sources made up? No. Obviously not. That's insane, right? All it means is we haven't found it yet, right? All it means is that we haven't uncovered it yet. We have no concrete physical proof that the city of Akkad existed, but only a crazy person would say that that therefore means the city of Akkad didn't exist. It would be exactly like the person saying, I need you to give me your Wendy's leftovers before I can believe you went to Wendy's. The testimony is the main thing. The archaeological evidence, that's the Wendy's leftovers. That's the Wendy's trash that confirms it. It's nice to have the archaeological confirmation, but we don't need the archaeological confirmation. And in very much the same way, Julius Caesar. How did Julius Caesar die? Oh, well, okay. This is not as impactful. Well, so Julius Caesar was assassinated by Brutus, Cassius, Mark Antony, right? He was stabbed like 37 times. The Shakespeare play, if you've seen the movie Mean Girls, right? They have to do like a modern stage rendition of Julius Caesar. And so one girl stands up, and her assignment is she's got to play. I think she's got to play Cassius. And she has to give a speech, and she's talking about how Brutus is just as cute as Caesar. Brutus is just as smart as Caesar. Brutus is just as popular as Caesar. So somebody should just like stab Caesar, right? That's from the movie Mean Girls. But so Caesar was stabbed to death because he was betrayed by his best friend and right-hand man, Brutus, in a conspiracy with Cassius, Mark Antony, and a whole bunch of others. That's a pivotal historical event. It's in every history textbook. It's referenced constantly in other things. It's one of the most well-known pieces of historical information today. And yet, guess what I'm going to say? We have no physical evidence that Caesar was assassinated. We have no archaeological, we have no physical, we have no material evidence that Julius Caesar was assassinated. We don't have the dead body of Julius Caesar filled with knife holes. We don't have anything along those lines. We don't have a tombstone for Julius Caesar that says, here lies JC, stabbed to death by his pals, right? We don't have archaeological evidence that Julius Caesar was assassinated. All the evidence we have of the assassination of Julius Caesar comes from what? Testimony. It all comes from historical testimony. The historians of the time recorded that Julius Caesar was betrayed by Brutus, Cassius, Mark Antony, that he was stabbed to death by Brutus. So, does that mean that Julius Caesar wasn't really assassinated? No. All it means is that we don't have physical proof that he was assassinated. And not having proof of something doesn't mean it didn't happen, right? Not having proof of something doesn't mean it didn't happen. All it means is that you don't have proof that it happened. Now, everything that I just said is extremely uncontroversial. Everybody agrees with everything I just said. There's a couple like crackpots on the internet who will say, you know, we can prove that Julius Caesar was never assassinated. We can prove that there was no city of Akkad. We can prove the Battle of Zama never happened. But those people are like, kind of like I talked about before, 14-year-olds on the internet, right? They're doofuses. Nobody takes them seriously in the historical field or in the archaeological field. So nobody worth paying attention to disagrees with any of these things I just said. I started with this very uncontroversial, very simple, secular set of examples because I want to move into a very controversial, very hotly contested, biblical example next. Kind of like I talked about at the very beginning, it is really common to hear people say, what? That archaeology disproves the Bible, right? First things first, one of the most common ones you hear is that archaeology disproves the story of the Exodus. I almost wrote Exodus. One of the most common things you'll hear from skeptics is that archaeology disproves the Exodus. They'll say archaeologists have conclusively disproven the story of the Exodus. They'll say archaeologists have gone, they've researched it, they've done some digging, they've studied it, and they found that the Israelites never went to Egypt. They found that the Israelites were never rescued from Egypt. They found that there was no, parting of the seas that then swept over the Egyptian army. They never escaped into the promised land. All of that. They'll say archaeologists have gone in and they've proven that the Exodus never happened. That sounds pretty serious, right? Problem is, that has no real basis in reality. Because when they say that archaeologists have disproved the Exodus, what do they actually mean? What they mean is, no archaeologist has ever proven the Exodus. That's what they mean. They mean, we've never found any ancient Egyptian shields, spears, helmets at the bottom of the sea. Therefore, the parting of the sea didn't happen. They're saying we've never found any corpses, any tombs filled with ancient enslaved Israelites. Therefore, Israeli slavery never happened. They're saying we haven't found any archaeological evidence that the Nile turned to blood. What would that even look like, right? Therefore, the Nile never turned to blood. They're saying we haven't found any mass child graves, therefore the death of all the firstborn never happened. They're not saying archaeologists have disproven the story of the Exodus. They're saying that the archaeologists haven't proved the story of the Exodus. That's what they're saying. Same thing applies to the Canaanite conquest. Remember that story? Canaanite conquest story. The Israelites first get into the promised land, and it's filled with Canaanites, and God says, go in and wipe out everybody. Now, in reality, you know a little more about the context of that story. All of the cities that the book of Joshua talks about, where God tells them to go in and wipe out everybody, they were not normal cities. You remember what they were? We've talked about this a little bit. They were military bases. So they go into the promised land, they go specifically to the military bases, and they wipe everybody at the military bases out. They go into combat zones, and they wipe out everybody. And what we learn from the rest of Joshua and Judges is that when the Israelites go in and they conquer each of those military bases in Canaan, the people in the normal cities do what? They run. They leave. And so there's that phrase, kill every man, woman, and child, but very few women, very few children would have been involved in that. So, breathe a little bit easier, right? It would be like going to Fort Bragg or something like that and waging a full-on assault. There would have been probably a few families living there with their soldier husbands and stuff like that, but it would have been very few. They'd be going into combat zones, wiping out all of the military-aged men. And so the story of the Canaanite conquest, the Israelites go into these military bases and they wipe them out at God's command. Now, what a lot of skeptics say is there is archaeological proof that the Canaanite conquest never happened. They say archaeologists have proved that the Canaanite conquest story is just something that the authors of the Bible made up. The list goes on. Now, take a wild guess about what they really mean when they say that. Yeah, they mean archaeologists have not proven that it happened. They mean if you go to the places where those military bases were, there's not a whole bunch of dead bodies buried under the ground. There's not a whole bunch of swords and spears and shields and helmets buried under the ground. Therefore, it didn't happen. But does that mean that didn't happen? No. It just means we haven't found proof that it happened. And there is nothing else in the world that we treat with this degree of skepticism, right? When your kid comes home from school and he says, I had a test today, you're not like, you got proof? You're just like, okay, I guess you had a test today, right? When your husband comes home and he's like, I got a drink with the guys at the bar, you're like, where are the bottles? Where were you really at? It's like, that's not how you do that. It's not how this works. And so in the same way, right, just because there's no swords and shields buried under the ground at Jericho doesn't mean that didn't happen. Just because there's not a bunch of mass child graves in Exodus doesn't mean the death of the firstborns didn't happen. All it means is that we haven't found proof yet. But we don't need to. Because just like everything else in history, these stories are based primarily on testimony. This is something that tends to shock people because you would think, people just tend to think that most of our historical knowledge is dependent on archaeological digs and finding old, things like that. But in reality, about 99% of what we know about history is based not on archaeology. It's based on what? Testimony. It's based on historical testimony. Probably 99% of what we know about history is based entirely on the testimony of ancient historians, ancient records, ancient letters, ancient diaries, not on archaeological digs. In fact, just as a thought experiment, if you swept away all the ancient historical testimony that we had, if you put some blinders on and refused to take into consideration, and you exclusively based your narrative of history on archaeology, how much do you think we would know about the past? Practically nothing. We'd have a handful of like old pots and pans. We'd have some old quills. We'd have some old pieces of papyrus and stuff like that. We would have no idea what to do with it. We would have no idea what it means. We would have no idea how to piece it together into anything like a coherent story or narrative. It would be pretty well useless to us. Archaeology can't tell us much of anything without testimony, without the ancient historical testimony that we've uncovered from ancient historians, ancient letters, ancient records, ancient diaries. And so when we learn something from a wealth of ancient historians, ancient records, ancient letters, and ancient diaries, we don't wait for archaeological proof to come in order to believe it. So, when you apply the same standards to the Exodus, the Canaanite conquest, the dynasty of King David, the whole gamut of Bible stories, when you apply the same standards to those stories that you apply to the Battle of Zama, the city of Akkad, the assassination of Julius Caesar, what you find is that these stories are roughly as well attested as anything else we think we know in history. No, we don't have proof that they happened, but we don't need archaeological proof that they happened. If we were going to be going more in depth, we could talk a whole lot about ancient records, letters, diaries, and so forth that we found that very strongly suggest that actually, yes, there were Jews in Egypt. And that actually, yes, they probably were slaves. And that actually, yes, they did escape at some point for some reason. And that, yes, they were famous for believing in some strange god that the rest of the Egyptians didn't believe in, right? So we found quite a bit of records, letters, diary entries, and so on that suggest that all of those things are true. In the same way, there are quite a few old records, old pronouncements from the tribal chief of various Canaanite tribes and so on and so forth, talking about these bands of marauders who came out of Egypt and are now wreaking havoc at their military bases. So we do have this kind of testimonial evidence that all of these things happen. What we lack is archaeological evidence. The problem is that really doesn't matter. And so, does archaeology disprove the Bible? No. For two reasons. One, the stories in the Bible have roughly the same testimonial evidence that most other historical stories that we easily accept has. And two, more importantly, because that's not how archaeology works. Archaeology can prove that something did happen, but it generally can't prove that something didn't happen. Once again, archaeology can prove that something did happen, but it really can't prove that something didn't happen. Archaeology can confirm what we know from testimony, but it can't really disprove much of anything. So,
That's kind of the first part of what we need to talk about. That's the part that's really not in the book. That's the part we need to know to set the groundwork for the rest of what we're going to talk about today. That sets the groundwork for what we do here in the book. Now we want to talk about archaeology and the Gospels in particular. So, what do you remember from the book about archaeology and the Gospels?
Well, some of it did confirm.
Yeah.
Some things they found did confirm what was written in the Gospels.
Yeah, that's good. That's exactly right. So we just talked about how archaeology can't really disprove something, but what archaeology can do is confirm what we know from historical testimony. And the fairly consistent finding of archaeologists has been that when we go on archaeological digs that in some way overlap with the areas that the Bible takes place in, or in some way kind of overlap with the stories that we find in the Bible, consistently those archaeological digs do what? They confirm the basic details of those stories. I want to talk about 3 specific case studies. There were like 10 or 15 in the chapter, but there's really only 3 that I think are really noteworthy. So I want to talk about these 3. I want to talk about 3 specific times when archaeology was able to confirm the testimony that we find in the Gospels. So first things first, I want to talk about Lysanias. Anybody remember Lysanias?
I really didn't.
That's okay. You'll remember once I start talking about it. So Lysanias. Take a look at Luke chapter 3, verse 1. Or don't. It really doesn't matter. I'm going to read it to you. But in Luke chapter 3, verse 1, Luke says, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod, tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, son of Zechariah, in the wilderness. That's Luke chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, actually. And so, for the longest time, a lot of skeptics would point to Luke chapter 3, verse 1, and they would say, that's proof that Luke is unreliable. They would say, that's proof that Luke's gospel is unreliable. Does anybody remember why they said that? Obviously, hint, it's because of Lysanias.
Well, I think it was because the dates didn't match up.
That's part of it, yeah. So, skeptics would look at Luke chapter 3, verse 1, which said Lysanias was the tetrarch of Abilene, and they would say, that can't be right, because Lysanias was the governor of Chalcis, sorry. Lysanias was the governor of Chalcis, and he was the governor of Chalcis when?
Half a century earlier.
Yeah, 50 years ago, in Chalcis. It would say Lysanias cannot have been the tetrarch of Abilene because Lysanias was the governor of Chalcis 50 years earlier. Now, in order to be the governor of anywhere, you've got to be a grown adult, right? So if he was a grown adult governing Chalcis 50 years earlier, how's he even going to be alive to be the tetrarch of Abilene during the time of the birth of John the Baptist and Jesus? That literally can't work. And so for the longest time, skeptics would say, what? They would say, there is proof that Luke is an unreliable historian. They would say that's proof that Luke doesn't understand the world he's talking about, that Luke wasn't actually there for those events, that Luke doesn't actually know who was in charge of what and when. They say that's a major problem for Luke, the historian. They say Luke's gospel is unreliable, it's inaccurate, it's untrustworthy. Then something happened. Anybody remember what happened?
They found an inscription.
Mm-hmm.
It says an inscription was later found from the time of Tiberius from AD 14 to 37.
Mm-hmm.
So that, which names, how do you pronounce it?
Lysanias, yeah.
As tetrarch in Abila.
Abila, yeah. So
just as Luke had written.
Exactly. So they're doing an archaeological dig, and they find an inscription that names the tetrarch of Abila, or the Abilene tetrarch. And the Abilene tetrarch's name is what? Lysanias. During what time period? AD 14 to 37. Now, I say during 14 to 37, it's an inscription from somewhere between 14 and 37. So Lysanias could have been the tetrarch for years before that, and could have stayed the tetrarch for years after that. That's just when they date the inscription to. So if Lysanias was tetrarch of Abila, at least between 14 and 37, that means that he has to be a different Lysanias than this guy over here, right? Because Luke 3:1 takes place probably in BC 5 or maybe AD 1 or 2, somewhere in there, right? And so if 50 years before that, Lysanias was the governor of Chalcis, then that would have been something like BC 50, right? So BC 50 to AD 37 is 87 years, right? And so math-wise, literally, these cannot be the same Lysanias. So what that means is, clearly, there was a second person named Lysanias. Right? Now that probably doesn't sound like I'm saying much, because I'm not. It's actually kind of funny now. It seems really obvious now, but two people can have the same name. Right? We know multiple Anns. We know multiple Annies, right? We know multiple Debbies. The list goes on. If you went to the store later this afternoon and you overheard a couple of people talking in line at the cashier's desk, and the lady was saying, yeah, so my boyfriend Ryan took me on a date. Would you guess A, that your pastor Ryan is cheating on his wife with the store lady, or B, that there's another person named Ryan who's dating the store lady? You're going to go with B, right? Yeah. Same thing should obviously have been the case here, right? When we looked at Luke 3:1 and it says Lysanias is the tetrarch of Abilene, the obvious assumption is, okay, that's probably a different Lysanias. And yet, a whole bunch of skeptics saw Luke refer to Lysanias, the tetrarch of Abilene, and immediately went directly to, that must be the same Lysanias, so Luke must have made a mistake, so Luke must be an unreliable historian. And yet, the very obvious solution to that is just that there were two people named Lysanias. One of them was the governor of Chalcis 50 years earlier. One of them was the tetrarch of Abilene. And so, for quite some time, skeptics were saying Luke 3:1 was proof that Luke is unreliable. But in reality, what it turned out was Luke knew more than we did at the time. At first, we thought it meant that Luke was untrustworthy. But then we found out it meant that Luke was very trustworthy. That Luke was ahead of modern historians. That Luke was ahead of what we knew at that time. And so here, archaeology confirmed the testimony of Luke as the first case study that I think is noteworthy. The second one involves the Gospel of John. Anybody remember what Lee Strobel and Jim McRae said about the Gospel of John, about the pool of Bethesda?
Well, people who disputed it didn't think it existed.
Yeah.
But then they found out that it did.
Mm-hmm.
It was just 40 feet below the ground.
You got it. That's exactly right. So, John chapter 5 says, and I quote, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there is in Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. So, like Debbie said, for the longest time, skeptics would point to John chapter 5 as proof that John was an unreliable historian. The reason that they said that was because for the longest time, no archaeologists had ever found the pool of Bethesda. They would go to the sheep gate, and they would look around, and they wouldn't see a pool, right? And so skeptics would jump from that and say, look, the pool of Bethesda literally doesn't exist. So John is an unreliable historian. They would say whoever wrote the Gospel of John wasn't familiar with the geography of Jerusalem because he was writing hundreds of years later from somewhere far away. They would say the author of John's Gospel is an unreliable historian. Then something happened. Just like Debbie said, archaeologists found what? They found the pool of Bethesda. They were doing an archaeological dig right near the sheep gate, and they dug a little ways, and then they dug a little more, and they dug a little more, and they got to where they were about 40 feet below the surface, because this is just kind of how things go. Cities will get leveled and then rebuilt on top of what was leveled, and then leveled again and then rebuilt on top of what was leveled, right? We do the same thing today. And so thousands of years from now, if they go and do an archaeological dig of Raleigh, they're going to find things that we currently see in Raleigh way below the surface. Does that make sense? Same thing was true there in Jerusalem. They get 40 feet under the street level. They get 40 feet under the surface as they're digging, and they find the ruins of the pool of Bethesda. They find it exactly where John said it would be. Same thing happened with the pool of Siloam from a different story in John. For the longest time, skeptics said there is no pool of Siloam. We've never found any pool of Siloam, so clearly John is unfamiliar with the geography of Jerusalem, so clearly John is an unreliable historian. And then what happened? We found the pool of Siloam. Then once again, they said, okay, well, there is no Jacob's well from John chapter 4. They say, we've never found anything like Jacob's well. Clearly, there's no Jacob's well. Clearly, John is inventing Jacob's well. Clearly, John is unfamiliar with the geography of ancient Israel. So clearly, John is an unreliable historian. And then, what do you think happened? We found Jacob's well. And then once again, the Jaffa Gate in, I think, John 19, right? Skeptics would say, we've never found anything like the Jaffa Gate. So clearly the Jaffa Gate doesn't exist. So clearly John is unfamiliar with the geography of ancient Israel. So clearly John is making this up. So clearly John is an unreliable historian. And then what happened? We found the Jaffa Gate. It just kept happening. And so gradually, the consensus among scholars, because when I talk about skeptics here, I'm usually not talking about archaeologists themselves. I'm usually not talking about historians themselves. I'm usually talking about people who look at the lack of evidence or the lack of findings and then kind of jump off into skepticism from there. And so gradually the consensus among historians, among archaeologists, among others is shifting, because 100 years ago the general consensus was that the Gospel of John was probably mostly made up by someone who probably didn't actually know Jesus a long time after that. But like we've talked about in past weeks, that consensus is shifting. They keep having to date it earlier and earlier and earlier because we keep finding new things that make it abundantly clear that the author of John's Gospel was intimately familiar with the geography of first century Israel. Geography that changed by the 2nd century. That was completely unrecognizable by the 3rd century. They didn't exist anymore by the 4th century. And so the only way the author of John could have accurately described this geography would have been how? To be there. And so gradually, over the last 100 years, scholarly consensus about the Gospel of John has shifted. And so now it's widely recognized as being a remarkably accurate, trustworthy, reliable historical document. And that's happening because of archaeology, not despite archaeology. Archaeology can really only do one thing, and that is it can confirm what we learn from historical testimony. And consistently with both the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of John, archaeology has done exactly that. Archaeology has overwhelmingly confirmed the things that can be confirmed in Luke and in John. And as we're about to see, it's done the same thing in Mark. So, the third case study that I want to talk about, really the last case study that I want to talk about, because I want to get you out in a reasonable time today. Last week was like 2 hours. Don't want to do that most weeks. But the third case study we want to talk about is the case study of Decapolis from Mark chapter 7. So in Mark 7:31, Mark says, "Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon down to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of the Decapolis." Once again, Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon, down to the Sea of Galilee, and into the region of Decapolis. Now, according to skeptics, what's wrong with that?
I think it was no such place.
Almost. That would be a little too easy.
Or it wasn't where they said it was.
There we go. So, for the longest time, skeptics would point to Mark 7:31, and they would say, there's proof that Mark is an unreliable historian, because if he was going through Sidon and into Decapolis, he would be going away from the Sea of Galilee. Once again, they say if Jesus went through Sidon and into Decapolis, he would be going the opposite direction of the Sea of Galilee. So you literally cannot go through Sidon, then to the Sea of Galilee, and then into Decapolis. That doesn't make geographical sense, right? It would be like if I said I drove from my house in Wake Forest down to Lewisburg, and then I turned off on 561, stopped in a pub in Durham real quick, and then got to the church, right? That doesn't work. That's not how that works. That's literally geographically impossible, right? From Lewisburg to here, Durham is not in the middle of that. You can't get there between here and there, right? So that's geographically impossible. In the same way, skeptics were saying that Mark 7:31 is geographically impossible. You cannot go out of Tyre into Sidon, through the Sea of Galilee, and into the city of Decapolis, because Decapolis is the opposite direction from the Sea of Galilee. Then, something happened. Anybody remember what it was?
Well, he went to see that, I can't remember the person's name, and that he pulled out all the maps
Yeah.
and showed him that there was a way that he could have done that by looking at the maps. That you just can't assume it's not right, because there are various different ways you could get to where you were going.
That's part of it. It's actually even more intense than that. So, Decapolis. We're going to draw a really, really terrible map. I have the art skills of a child. Actually, I shouldn't insult children by comparing them to my art skills. We were with a couple of friends of ours last night, and she's like a professional painter, and so we were all painting on canvases, and mine is horrific, like literally horrifying. Like Elise's painting was all nice, and I was trying to paint something nice too, and it looks like, I don't know, it looks like the cover of a heavy metal album or something like that. Yeah, so here's our problem. Here's Decapolis. Here is Sidon. Here is the Sea of Galilee. Oh man, no, wait. I used too much of the board. Hold on. Here's Decapolis. Here is Sidon. Here is the Sea of Galilee. You cannot come out of here and pass through here to get to here. This is the city of Decapolis. For the longest time, skeptics said this is geographically impossible. Therefore, what? Mark is an unreliable historian. Then, archaeology happened. Specifically, what happened was the more digs we did and the more we found in this area in our archaeological digs, the more we discovered that this is not the only thing called Decapolis. This is the city of Decapolis, but there was a whole region called Decapolis. Decapolis didn't just refer to the city of Decapolis proper. Decapolis referred to an entire region, an entire kind of confederation of villages.
A confederation of like 10 cities, it says?
Yeah, I don't know if I drew 10 or not, but that's just, pretend that's 10, right? Decapolis referred to an entire set of settlements that surrounded the Sea of Galilee, that wrapped around Sidon and Tyre. And so wherever Jesus was, whatever direction he would have walked, he would have been on his way to where? Decapolis. And so when Jesus goes through Sidon, then he heads towards the Sea of Galilee. He could have gone on to Decapolis in almost any direction. Because Decapolis doesn't just mean the city of Decapolis. Decapolis means any of these 10 villages, any of these 10 settlements that are spread out all over the area. It's kind of like, this is maybe going to annoy you, but it's kind of like how there are quite a few places you can go and technically be in Lewisburg, right? People don't want to accept it, but we are sitting on Lewisburg land right now. Like it or not, Mount Zion Baptist Church has a Lewisburg zip code, right? You have a Lewisburg zip code. You have a Lewisburg address. If a cop pulls you over on the road, you pull out your driver's license. What does it say on it? Lewisburg. Now you talk to people who've lived here a long time, they're like, we're not from Lewisburg. We're from Gold Sands. And I'm like, no, you are from Lewisburg. Objectively. Right? Like, we're not from Lewisburg, we're from Centerville. It's like, you're from Lewisburg. We're not from Lewisburg, we're from White Level. It's like, you are from Lewisburg. Gold Sands is in Lewisburg. White Level is in Lewisburg. You can like it or dislike it, but this is where you live. This is Lewisburg now. The march of history moves on. Same kind of thing, right? You could say, I'm not from Decapolis, I'm from such and such village. And you could say, shut up, you're from Decapolis. Accept reality, right? Decapolis wrapped all around here, and we know that now because the more archaeological digs we did, the more we found documents, the more we found testimony, the more we found inscriptions, the more we found ancient maps, the more we found ancient travel guides that referred to this whole vast tract of land as what? Decapolis. And so over the last 30 years or so, the skeptics who used to say Mark 7:31 is proof that Mark is an unreliable historian because Mark is unfamiliar with the geography of Galilee. And so Mark is probably making this up or inventing it. The same skeptics who used to say that have had to kind of eat their words. Because what archaeology demonstrated for us is that Luke described the region of Decapolis exactly the way that any ancient person would have described the region of Decapolis. Once again, here in case study 3, what archaeology did is what archaeology always does. It confirmed the testimonies that we already had in the scriptures. And so whether it's Mark, Luke, or John, there are other examples we could give from Matthew, but I wanted to make it an even 3, an odd 3. Whether it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, consistently, archaeology has confirmed the testimony of the Gospels. So, what we have when we take it all together, whether we're talking about the Exodus, the Canaanite conquest, the kingdom of David, the 4 Gospels, the history we see in Acts, whatever it is, consistently, archaeology has confirmed rather than debunked the things that can be tested. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is the difference between the way that archaeology has interacted with Christianity and the way that archaeology has interacted with religions like Mormonism and Islam. I am not about to say what you maybe think I'm about to say. I've been to a whole lot of apologetics, conferences, stuff like that, where people said something along the lines of this. Maybe you've heard something like this in like a Facebook video or something. They'll say, archaeology has disproved Islam. Archaeology has disproved Mormonism. But archaeology has proved Christianity. Ever heard somebody say something like that? None of those things are true. Archaeology has not disproved Mormonism. Archaeology has not disproved Islam, and archaeology has not proven Christianity. Why? Because what we talked about at the beginning. That is not how archaeology works. But here's what we can say. There is a difference between archaeology's relationship to the Bible and archaeology's relationship to the Quran. There is a difference between archaeology's relationship to the Bible and archaeology's relationship to Mormonism. The difference is this. The Book of Mormon and the Quran are filled with remarkable stories about what would be major historical events, and there is absolutely no archaeological confirmation of those stories. Once again, the Quran and the Book of Mormon are filled with stories, kind of like the Bible has the Exodus, right? Kind of like the Bible has the Canaanite conquest, kind of like the Bible has the kingdom of David, right? The Quran and the Book of Mormon are filled with stories that would be major historical events. They would be vastly important historical events. But, unlike the stories in the Bible, there is absolutely no archaeological confirmation of those stories. Now, first things first, I want to remind you of what that doesn't mean. That doesn't mean they didn't happen, right? Like the Book of Mormon has an entire alternative history of North America, right? I don't know if you know much about the Book of Mormon, but the Book of Mormon takes place in America. Literally, the story of the Book of Mormon is Jesus goes to America. I don't know if you knew that. It's like an 80s comedy that would have starred like Chevy Chase or something. Jesus Does America, right? Jesus' American Vacation. That's what the Book of Mormon is. It's about a trip that Jesus takes to America to go evangelize among the Native Americans. That's what the Book of Mormon is entirely about. And it talks about all these massive battles, all these everythings, and there's no archaeological confirmation for any of it. Now, that does not mean it didn't happen, right? Like we said before, archaeology can prove that something did happen, but it cannot do what? Cannot prove that it didn't happen. So, unfortunately, a lot of Christian teachers and apologists will say the dumbest thing in the world. They'll say, archaeology has disproven Mormonism. No, it has not. Because that isn't how archaeology works. In the same way, the Quran, I was about to say the Book of Islam, that's not a thing. The Quran, right? In the same way, the Quran talks about a whole bunch of things that would be major historical events, and there is absolutely no archaeological confirmation for them. And so a lot of Christian apologists say, what? They say archaeology has disproven Islam. But no, it has not. We have to use the same standards on other people that we use on ourselves, right? We can't say archaeology can't disprove the Bible, but then for exactly the same reasons say archaeology has disproven the Quran. We can't do that. That's dishonest, right? And so archaeology has not disproven Mormonism or Islam, but there is a difference. The difference is this. There is zero archaeological confirmation for the major claims of either of these two books, but there is a wealth of archaeological confirmation for the things that can be confirmed in the Bible. To the point that the Smithsonian put out a couple of statements. I think they talk about it a little bit in the chapter for this week, but the Smithsonian Institute literally put out a statement. The Church of Jesus Christ the Latter-day Saints, that's the Mormon church. They, for a long time, part of their evangelistic materials was that they would go out and they would say, did you know that historians have been using the Book of Mormon as a guide to pre-American history, here in the New World? They would say, like, a lot of, basically they were saying that, like, the Smithsonian Institute and all these other kind of historical think tanks and institutes and stuff, they would say they were using the Book of Mormon as a guide to learn more about America before, like, the days of the colonists, before the founding fathers arrived and stuff like that. They said the Book of Mormon was like a guide. The Smithsonian Institute, therefore, put out a statement and said, no, we have not. They said the Smithsonian Institute has never used the Book of Mormon as a scientific guide in any way. They said Smithsonian archaeologists see no direct connection between the archaeology of the New World and the subject matter of the Book of Mormon. To put that into normal people language, they say, we have found absolutely nothing confirming any of the stories in the Book of Mormon. And we've looked. Now, that does not mean the Book of Mormon stories are not true, right? All it means is we have never confirmed any of it. Same thing is true for the Quran. We could pull out some quotes, but I want to, get out of here by 12. And so Mormonism and Islam, like the Bible, make massive claims about things that would be earth-shattering historical events. But unlike the Bible, the Book of Mormon and the Quran have absolutely no archaeological confirmation. That doesn't prove they're not true, but it reveals a stark difference between the Quran, the Book of Mormon, and the Bible. Because when you turn your sights over to the Bible, again and again and again, time after time after time, archaeology confirms the testimonies of the Bible. So, does archaeology disprove the Bible? No. No. And once you start to know kind of what we're diving into here, we realize that this is actually a very stupid question. Cool? That's all I've got.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
You can see why I think that chapter is really considerably less important than the other ones, because it's like you go through this whole long process and you don't really prove anything, right? You go through this whole long process and you don't really gain much of anything. All you do going through this whole long process is you remove an incredibly stupid objection that people should know better than, right? And so it's like running as fast as you can just to stay in the same place. And it's not really, I don't think I've ever had any conversation where any of this came up. And so this is, for me, not really, this is just not really a big thing for me. It's, yeah.
I don't think everyday people would even worry about this.
No.
When you're talking to them about the Bible. Think about it.
Yeah, and a lot of this stuff, this is the kind of stuff that, like, you're only ever going to hear anything like any of this from like a bona fide, dyed-in-the-wool skeptic. Most of the time, the things that we're going to be confronted with has less to do with passionate disbelief. It's going to have mostly to do with people who vaguely believe but just don't care. That's the demon we're fighting. Right? The issue here in the Bible Belt is mostly apathy, not unbelief. It's hard to reason people out of apathy, you know? Yeah. Well, does anybody have any questions? Okay. I think next week's chapter is significantly more, well, one, I just personally find it more interesting, and two, it's more relevant, I think, to actual situations you'll actually encounter, actual conversations you'll actually have, stuff like that. And more than that, it's just, I find next week's stuff more interesting. Yeah. Well, okay.
Can you go check that grill?
Yeah,
See
we
if it
need
works, yeah. Make sure that works today.
Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm glad you came this morning.